We are back. I just explained to Ricardo, I don't want you to think that I'm cutting our conversation short tonight because I admire you too much, but we got a little behind time, and I wanted to devote a little time to this gentleman, which I think...
Johnny Carson was the king of late-night television. Charming, funny, and trusted by millions. But behind the laughter and celebrity smiles, Carson sat across from guests who carried secrets that couldn't be spoken on air. In an era when Hollywood's biggest stars were carefully crafted illusions, Carson knew which stories were real and which ones were scripted to protect careers. Join us as we uncover the stories of the 9 guests Johnny Carson knew were secretly gay. Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson was the kind of man Hollywood built its dreams on. Tall, handsome, and endlessly charming, he was the face that millions of women in the 1950s and 60s adored. On screen, he was the perfect gentleman, strong, funny, and romantic. Off-screen, his studio worked hard to make sure that image stayed flawless. What audiences didn't know, and what only a few in Hollywood circles whispered about, was that Rock Hudson's public life was carefully designed to hide a truth that could have ended his career. He was gay. Johnny Carson, who interviewed Hudson several times on The Tonight Show, knew the truth. People at NBC and in the Hollywood community had long known, though they never said it out loud. Behind the curtain, there was a quiet understanding. Hudson was America's leading man, and in the 1950s, being openly gay meant professional ruin. Carson respected Hudson and understood the stakes, but it made every interview tense. Both men knew there were lines that couldn't be crossed, questions that couldn't be asked, and smiles that had to cover what everyone already knew. The truth was, Hudson's entire life had been managed for appearances. His agent, Henry Wilson, was one of Hollywood's most powerful fixers. He built Hudson's career and his public image, and when rumors about Hudson's began to swirl, Wilson acted quickly. He arranged a marriage between Hudson and his own secretary, Phyllis Gates, in 1955. The marriage lasted only 3 years, but its purpose was clear: to make Hudson appear like every other straight movie star. The studios promoted their marriage in magazines, showing them as the picture of newlywed bliss. It was a perfect illusion, designed not for love, but for survival. For Hudson, the pressure was enormous. Every interview, every red carpet appearance, and every film role depended on keeping the secret. On The Tonight Show, Carson could sense Hudson's unease. He was charming and professional, but there was a tightness under the surface, a man constantly aware that one slip could destroy everything he had worked for. Carson later described this as one of the hardest parts of his job: pretending not to know, keeping up the fiction on live television while knowing the cost to the person sitting across from him. Hudson's story took a tragic turn in the 1980s. In 1985, he became one of the first major celebrities to die from AIDS-related complications. His illness forced the world to confront what had long been hidden. Suddenly, the rumors became reality, and the public had to face the man behind the myth. Carson was deeply affected. Friends and colleagues said he felt guilt, not because he had done anything wrong personally, but because he had been part of the system that forced Hudson to live a lie. He admired Hudson's strength, but was troubled by the idea that such a kind, talented man had never been allowed to be himself. And Hudson's story was only the beginning, because Carson knew he'd sat across from others hiding the very same secret. Cary Grant and Randolph Scott. Cary Grant and Randolph Scott shared a Santa Monica beach house that insiders called Bachelor Hall, and almost everyone in Hollywood knew what it meant. Two of the era's most famous leading men lived together for years, building a private life that the studios never openly explained. The arrangement wasn't hidden so much as packaged. Friends visited, photographers came by, and the story the public got was simple: two bachelors sharing a home to save money and enjoy the California sun. Within the industry, people understood there was more to it, but polite silence ruled the day. Johnny Carson stepped into this tension whenever Cary Grant sat in his guest chair. On air, Carson would ask about Grant's latest film, his travels, or his marriages, 5 in all. Off-air, he knew those marriages functioned as shields. He understood there were truths that couldn't be spoken on a national broadcast in the mid-20th century. So, he played his own part, the smooth host who could dance around delicate topics without seeming to dodge them. It was a double performance, with Grant performing the role of the world's most elegant ladies' man, and Carson performing the role of the curious interviewer who never reached for the question everyone in the business already knew the answer to. Grant's masculinity was a carefully made thing. Born Archibald Leach in England, he remade himself in Hollywood into Cary Grant, the man in the perfect suit with the effortless smile. That persona wasn't just branding, it was protection. The charm, the tuxedo, the timing, and the irresistible on-screen chemistry with top actresses. These elements built a wall between the public and the private man. The persona gave him room to work, to be adored, and to avoid the kind of scrutiny that could end a career. It also kept people from asking what Bachelor Hall really represented. The studios helped shape the story. Fan magazines ran spreads of Grant and Scott at home, posing in bathrobes, cooking, exercising, reading, and relaxing. The photos looked cozy and domestic, but the captions framed it as friendly roommate life, 2 hard-working stars unwinding after long days on set. This was the coded language of the time. The public got wholesome pictures of 2 tidy buddies. Insiders saw a portrait of something more intimate. By never saying the wrong word, the studios said exactly what they needed to say to maintain the illusion. The story of Grant and Scott shows how Hollywood packaged private lives for mass comfort. And Carson knew this pattern would surface again with other guests who brought their own carefully protected truths. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy's story was sold as one of the greatest love affairs in Hollywood history. A passionate 26-year romance between 2 legends who couldn't be together because of Tracy's religion. For decades, that story was treated as fact. The truth, however, was far more complicated. Behind the headlines and movie promotions, the relationship functioned as a quiet agreement between 2 stars who needed each other for very different reasons. Johnny Carson, who spoke with Hepburn several times throughout her career, admired her intelligence and strength, but he also understood that much of her public love story had been built for the cameras, not from real intimacy. Carson was fascinated by how well the myth worked. It had all the ingredients the public wanted: devotion, tragedy, and forbidden love. Studio publicity teams reinforced it at every opportunity, portraying Hepburn as the loyal companion and Tracy as the tortured man bound by faith. What no one talked about was how neatly this narrative protected both stars from questions about their private lives. Carson later told friends that the more he learned about the truth, the more he realized how perfectly it had all been staged. The public saw romance, Hollywood saw a strategic alliance. The arrangement benefited both of them. Tracy, a devout Catholic, never divorced his wife, Louise. The relationship with Hepburn gave him a respectable public explanation for living apart from his family, while avoiding the scandal of being seen as unfaithful or promiscuous. For Hepburn, the connection to Tracy provided an even more valuable shield. It gave her a reason to remain unmarried and live independently without attracting unwanted attention to her personal relationships with women. Carson recognized how mutually protective this was. Each of them offered the other cover. He got emotional stability and public sympathy, and she got freedom and privacy. Away from the cameras, Hepburn lived a life that didn't fit the Hollywood mold. She shared homes with women like Laura Harding, who was often described as her companion, and later had a long, close relationship with Phyllis Wilborn, whom she referred to as her partner and assistant. The public, though, preferred the myth. The image of Tracy and Hepburn as Hollywood's great tragic lovers was simply too powerful to challenge. Movies like Woman of the Year and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner reinforced their chemistry, and magazines celebrated Hepburn's loyalty after Tracy's death in 1967. The story was irresistible, and the industry had no reason to correct it. Carson respected how skillfully it was managed. He knew Hepburn was no one's victim. She was deliberate, sharp, and always in control. Yet he couldn't ignore how deeply the system relied on deception to protect reputations and maintain illusions. And as Carson would soon realize, the next story involved a man whose on-screen honesty only made his private secrets harder to hide. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando built his career on honesty. He was the actor who tore down old Hollywood traditions, bringing raw emotion and realness to the screen. His performances in A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, and The Godfather changed acting forever. To audiences, Brando seemed fearless. He said what he thought and felt what he said. But behind the scenes, he was keeping a secret that didn't fit the image of the tough, rebellious leading man. Brando's private life was far more complicated than the public ever knew. The man who represented total authenticity on screen was carefully guarding a truth about himself that the world wasn't ready to accept. Johnny Carson was fascinated by that contradiction. When Brando appeared on The Tonight Show, he was unpredictable, intense, and sometimes evasive. Carson loved that energy. It made for good television, but he also sensed the divide between Brando's public confidence and his private caution. He knew from friends and producers that Brando's relationships were not limited to the women the tabloids wrote about. Behind the scenes, people in Hollywood whispered about his affairs with both men and women, and about how much effort went into keeping that side of his life hidden. For Carson, this secrecy stood out. Brando had built his reputation on emotional honesty, yet he had to hide a part of who he was just to keep working. Rumors about Brando's relationships circulated for decades. His connection with James Dean was one of the most persistent. Both men were considered icons of masculine rebellion, young, intense, and independent. But many insiders believed they shared more than artistic influence. Stories spread about private meetings, shared apartments, and a mutual attraction that had to be carefully disguised. Whether the details were true or exaggerated hardly mattered. In Hollywood, even whispers could destroy careers. For Brando, who had already developed a reputation as difficult and defiant, any public acknowledgement of his would have given the studios an excuse to end his career altogether. The irony wasn't lost on Carson. Brando and Dean had reshaped what it meant to be a man on screen. They made vulnerability powerful and turned sensitivity into strength. Yet both lived under pressure to appear traditionally masculine in their real lives. Carson later remarked to friends that this contradiction said more about America than about Brando himself. Hollywood had created an ideal of manhood so rigid that even its greatest symbol of authenticity had to pretend. In later years, Brando began to speak more openly. He admitted in interviews that he had relationships with men, and that he didn't see as something fixed or shameful. By that point, he no longer needed to protect his image. Carson respected this honesty. He saw it as a rare act of self-acceptance in a business built on pretending. For Carson, Brando's late-life candor brought his story full circle. The man who had always acted without fear had finally spoken. Without fear, too. James Dean. James Dean's legend is built on purity, raw talent, youth, and a restless spirit that felt honest in a decade hungry for new voices. But inside Hollywood, a different story moved quietly from one insider to another. People talked about a young actor who made hard choices to break into an industry run by powerful men. The whispers said Dean formed transactional relationships with influential figures who could open doors: casting directors, agents, producers, and patrons. Some named specific men, most often Rogers Brackett, a radio director who helped Dean early on. Whether every detail is true or not, the pattern behind the rumors was clear. In a town where gatekeepers controlled everything, the least powerful people sometimes traded what they had to survive. Johnny Carson never met Dean. Dean died in 1955, years before Carson took over The Tonight Show. But Carson heard the stories from guests who did know him and from old Hollywood hands who had seen the machine up close. Carson's view wasn't moral panic. He saw Dean as a vivid example of what the system did to young talent. In Carson's eyes, the problem wasn't Dean's character. The problem was a business that made people hide, bargain, and compromise just to get a screen test or a second chance. When people repeated the rumors to Carson, he didn't judge Dean. He judged the rules that forced a young actor to turn his private life into currency. This is how power and survival worked in a homophobic industry. If you were an ambitious young man and you weren't protected by family money or studio contracts, you needed champions. If you also weren't straight, or if you were simply willing to do what it took, you faced an even harsher set of choices. The risks were real: exposure, blacklisting, and humiliation. The rewards were real too: introductions, training, auditions, and roles. Dean's own rise was shockingly fast. 3 major films, East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant, and then the car crash. That pace fed the myth and kept the questions unanswered. Did he make a bargain to get there? Or was he just that good? Hollywood was fine leaving it blurry. Dean's early death did something few publicists could manage. It cleaned the record. The Rebel remained forever young, forever promising, forever untouched by middle age or scandal. The rumors stayed rumors. There was no time for tell-all interviews or slips on live television. There was no slow change in public attitudes pushing him toward truth. Death froze the frame. Carson understood that. He often said that early death protects a star's image because it prevents the messy parts of life from catching up. With Dean, it sealed a version of the Rebel that fans could love without doubt. Stick around, because the next story shows how one star turned this trap into a kind of power. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich was one of the few classic Hollywood stars who seemed to play by her own rules. From the beginning of her career, she refused to fit into the American idea of how a woman should look, behave, or love. Her confidence and control over her image were unlike anything audiences had seen before. While many of her peers hid behind studio-crafted illusions, Dietrich was unapologetically herself, even if she never said everything out loud. She made her difference part of her identity and turned what could have been seen as scandalous into something magnetic. Johnny Carson admired her for that. When she appeared on The Tonight Show, she brought the same sophistication that defined her film career. She spoke carefully but carried authority. Carson noticed that Dietrich never pretended to be someone she wasn't. She didn't rely on studio handlers or pre-approved talking points. Every word, every gesture, felt like it came from someone who had long ago decided to live on her own terms. For Carson, who had interviewed hundreds of stars trained to dodge real conversation, that honesty was refreshing. He knew about her reputation in Hollywood circles, her relationships with both men and women, and her non-traditional marriage, and he respected how calmly she managed it all without apology. Part of Dietrich's protection came from being European. Her accent, her background, and her worldliness created a distance that American audiences romanticized instead of judged. She could appear in men's clothing, speak openly about passion, and still be accepted because people saw her as exotic rather than rebellious. The same behavior from an American actress might have ended a career, but Dietrich's foreign mystique gave her immunity. Carson often remarked to friends that her independence worked because it came wrapped in sophistication. Americans didn't know whether to be shocked or impressed. and she made sure they stayed both. Her style became her armor and her weapon. Dietrich wore tailored suits, crisp white shirts, and tuxedos long before women in Hollywood dared to do so. She made androgyny glamorous, turning queerness into allure rather than risk. Her smoky voice and quiet confidence made people want to see more, not question her choices. She created a public persona that was open without being explicit, letting her appearance do the talking in a way that couldn't be censored. Carson, who understood how television shaped perception, appreciated how perfectly she used images to tell the truth without saying a word. To Carson, Marlene Dietrich wasn't hiding. She was navigating. She turned the restrictions that trapped others into a stage for self-expression. And after her, Carson's attention turned to another guest who lived behind one of Hollywood's most elaborate fictions, Raymond Burr. Raymond Burr spent decades playing television's ultimate truth seeker. As Perry Mason, he stood for honesty, logic, and justice, winning over audiences who trusted him completely. Yet, off-screen, Burr was living behind one of Hollywood's most elaborate lies. The man who built a career out of exposing deceit had to invent an entire biography to keep his own truth hidden. In an era when being openly gay could end a career overnight, he created a false past so convincing that even close colleagues believed it. The story Burr presented to the public was detailed and dramatic. He spoke of 3 marriages, none of which ever happened, and of a son who had tragically died in a plane crash. He mentioned wartime injuries that were never recorded and military service that didn't exist. Studio publicists repeated these details in press releases and fan magazine profiles, turning fiction into fact. The invented tragedies gave Burr a depth that audiences found moving. It also created a wall between his public image and his private life. The more people sympathized with his losses, the less likely they were to ask questions about why he lived alone or why he avoided romantic publicity. Johnny Carson interviewed Burr several times on The Tonight Show and later admitted that those conversations always felt strange. Carson respected Burr's professionalism and intelligence, but he sensed a kind of distance, like he was speaking to a role instead of a man. Burr came prepared with carefully polished stories, all fitting the biography he had invented. Carson later described the experience as interviewing a character, not a person. He understood why Burr did it, but he found it sad. Here was a man admired for moral certainty, forced to build his safety out of lies. The paradox fascinated Carson. Burr's most famous role was a lawyer who fought for truth, defending the innocent and exposing deceit. Yet the actor behind the role had to hide one of the most basic truths about himself, simply to keep working. Carson saw it as one of Hollywood's cruelest contradictions, a world that demanded authenticity on camera, but punished it in real life. Burr's false family and tragic backstory weren't acts of vanity. They were acts of survival in a time that offered no other options. Behind the public mask, Burr shared a long, loving partnership with Robert Benavides, an actor and producer he met on the Perry Mason set in 1960. The two built a quiet life together that lasted more than 3 decades. They ran an orchid business and later a vineyard, living as devoted companions while the world saw them as business partners. Those who knew them privately described the relationship as stable, warm, and filled with mutual respect. When Burr died in 1993, he left his estate to Benavides, who later spoke about their shared life with quiet dignity, confirming what had long been rumored. For Carson, Burr's story was heartbreaking but human, a reminder of the cost of secrecy and the strength it took to live under constant disguise. And the next story pushed that theme even further, with a Hollywood couple whose double life fooled nearly everyone. Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester. Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester built a marriage that looked traditional from the outside but worked very differently on the inside. They married in 1929 and stayed together until Laughton's death in 1962. To the public, they were a loyal couple who managed 2 busy careers with grace. To friends and colleagues, it was understood that both were gay and that their marriage was a practical agreement that gave each of them cover and companionship. It was a union that protected them in an industry and era that punished honesty. Johnny Carson was intrigued by how smoothly they carried this off for so long. When Lanchester appeared on The Tonight Show after Laughton's passing, she projected affection and respect for her late husband without telling false stories about passion or domestic bliss. She didn't volunteer personal details, and Carson didn't press. What interested him was the way the two had made deception look like devotion without bitterness or drama. Their public image didn't feel forced. It felt careful, measured, and professional. Two people keeping what mattered private and letting the work speak for them. The partnership worked because it was grounded in shared purpose. Laughton was a towering actor and director, famous for roles in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Mutiny on the Bounty, and Witness for the Prosecution. Lanchester had her own memorable career, including The Bride of Frankenstein and a long list of character roles that showed sharp comic timing and a distinctive presence. They collaborated often, critiqued each other's performances, and moved between stage and screen with discipline. At home, they built a creative life where respect came first. They didn't pretend to be romantic in private circles. They were partners in the truest sense, supporting each other's projects, protecting each other's reputations, and sharing a household that let them work without fear of scandal. The press helped shape the myth. Studio publicists offered tidy stories of a devoted couple, and fan magazines ran photos that matched that script. Audiences believed what they were shown. They saw Lanchester as the witty wife, and Laughton as the serious artist, and they trusted the illusion because it was familiar and comforting. In public, the couple stayed on message. No messy details, no slips, no sudden revelations. That consistency kept reporters from digging and allowed both stars to keep working without the distraction of rumor. In the end, Laughton and Lanchester proved that a marriage could be honest about everything, but the one thing the world refused to accept. Next up is a matinee idol whose beauty opened every door while closing off the chance to live freely. Tyrone Power. Tyrone Power rose on the strength of his looks. Fox sold him as the perfect leading man, elegant, athletic, and romantic, and the public agreed. His face filled magazines and theater lobbies for 2 decades. That beauty opened every door, but it also fixed him in a narrow role that left little room for a private self. He became the studio's dependable fantasy, the man who could swashbuckle by day and kiss the girl by night. The image made him rich and famous. It also put him under a spotlight that never dimmed. The studio knew how to protect that image. Power's relationships with women were emphasized, photographed, and promoted. He married 3 times, first to the French actress Annabella, then to Linda Christian, and finally to Deborah Ann Menardos in 1958. Those marriages fit the poster boy narrative the studio needed. Meanwhile, Hollywood insiders spoke in quieter tones about a private life that didn't match the ads. Friends and colleagues said Power kept relationships with men out of view, careful about who knew and where he went. The contrast was stark, the public lover and the private man. The public saw a matinee idol who belonged to every woman in the audience. The private circle saw someone who moved carefully to protect himself in a hostile era. Johnny Carson never interviewed Power. Power died in 1958, before Carson took The Tonight Show. But Carson later heard the stories that circulated through green rooms and after parties, and he understood the pattern. In Carson's view, Power was caught in a curse of perfection. The more adored you were, the less freedom you had. Perfection brought opportunity, but it also made every step risky. For a star like Power, even friendly company could turn dangerous if it fed the wrong rumor. Carson saw how studios took that pressure and turned it into policy. They arranged photo spreads, managed dinner dates, and pushed the narrative that kept ticket sales strong. The person under the legend had to live around the legend. The final irony is hard to miss. Power died at 44, suffering a heart attack while filming in Spain. He didn't live to see the cultural shifts of the 1960s and 1970s, when some stars began to test the old rules and new conversations slowly opened. His death locked in the image the studio made: the perfect face, the perfect lover, the perfect hero. It also cut off the chance for any later honesty. We don't know how he might have spoken about himself if he'd had the safety and time others found years later. Power's story is a reminder that the most polished legend often hides the most guarded life, and Carson knew there were more guarded lives waiting in the wings. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for the next one.